Hello, welcome to POS 100, American Government. So this is a continuation of the discussions that we began having sometime last week on interest groups and how they organize for influence. Last week we talked about a couple of different things. For example, what interest groups might be, and of course these are organizations that seek to raise funds and to cultivate influence with legislators and other um, and policymakers. And this is not the same as political parties. These are interest groups. These are people who have the same interest, and so they seek to pursue it in various ways. We talked about federalism and how interest groups can influence policy, so whether they're influencing legislative affairs, policy making, that is kind of what we are talking about here. So these are quite highly organized, and because of the organization and funding, they can actually leverage more money and more influence. Even though perhaps this was not the founders' intention for money to influence Americans' lives in the way that they do. So there are quite a number of different interest groups, but particularly economic groups which focus on economic purposes like jobs, high wages, profits, protection. So if you, I'm not sure if you were paying attention to the previous week when the president of the Teamsters had a very interesting exchange with the senator. And so the Teamsters, and for example, SIU are labor protection groups, and so this is connected to economics. So are interest groups and worker groups. For example, the recent strike at different automakers, United Auto Workers Union (UAW), is an example of an economic group. Maybe we don't think of this necessarily as economic labor groups, but they are, and maybe business groups are more visible. So our labor groups, farm groups, and other professional groups, but also recreational groups. And so if you sort of think about the money that goes into lobbying, so lobbying is the attempt to influence legislators or legislation or both. And so if you think about the different types of lobbying groups, you will see that business firms and trade associations carry the bulk of lobbying activities and attempts. There are citizen groups, and so these are not economic groups, and they are motivated by a shared goal. So these are what we call purposive, intensive against material incentives, and so there are quite a number of these groups. So for example, ACLU is pretty well known. If you think of NAACP, this is an example. Now, some are single interest. So for example, the National Rifle Association or the NRA, the Second Amendment is their whole thing. And some of these groups can be ideological, others are pragmatic. So, for example, there are those people who believe in the Second Amendment as inviolable. And so there's some ideology to this, but there's also other ideologies. For example, if you sort of think about the Greens, whose whole thing is about protecting the environment and so on. So you do see some of that ideology. Now, there is a sort of discernible leaning towards certain issues by different groups. So for example, gun rights groups and pro-life groups tend to favor and contribute to primarily to Republican candidates at the rate of almost 90 to 99%, while groups that are interested in or are engaged in civil liberties and the environment tend to favor Democratic candidates. And so this is especially in the in the different committees that they form or where they raise and spend money. Now, citizens groups are far fewer. This might reflect the notion that came out in the 1920s, yes, a century ago, that America's the chief business of the American people is business. So you can expect that economic groups, business groups are more, but they also have abundant resources. It's one thing to believe something, but it's another to have the money to back it and to have the influence. So if you sort of think about what they do, a lot of them will favor individual goods, while the non-economic groups offer collective goods. So, for example, if you think of the NAACP or ACLU, they're those people who will contribute and be very highly engaged, but when laws are struck down or made, they tend to favor everyone. And so here we can see what is called a free rider problem. Imagine you're cycling a bicycle in tandem, and one person stops cycling. They are still going to enjoy the benefits of the bicycle moving, but they are not contributing to the movement itself. So we do see that non-economic groups can have this particular problem. Now, a lot of them are also smaller compared to the economic groups, even though the economic groups might also be very small firms that directly lobby. And so when we think of economic groups, they have the resources that are necessary for political action, so contribution to candidates or retreats and those kinds of things. You may have heard, for example, the Supreme Court justice who had been taking private or taking vacations on private islands and those kinds of things. A lot of these are individuals or groups. When these are linked to the industry, there's a smaller number, but some are actually very, very influential. So if you think about an industry, and maybe this is not necessarily an industry, it's an area such as foreign policy, you'll find a lot of foreign policy groups and think tanks and those kinds of things. And so you do see this diversity of ideas and groups and sizes, but also sometimes economic groups have this disadvantage of people who do not join for political benefits, but they are probably equally committed. Now, in terms of citizens groups, a lot of these, because they're policy oriented and they are voluntary, you see more participation because it's an ideological commitment. So if you think of, for example, Planned Parenthood or other opposed groups like the Family Research Council, people join these groups because they believe in these causes, and so they support their leaders, even though sometimes they'll be falling out. So if you think of, for example, BLM and what the leaders have done, that can be a challenge. Now, the thing about citizens groups is that they have to raise funds, and sometimes this is through membership or conventions and other things. Again, if you think of paying fees for certain things, and this is actually what happens with a lot of public unions, people do like to the benefits, but not necessarily the contributions. And this is actually one of the things, like if for example, NRA is pushing legislation for open carry in Virginia, even if I don't join the NRA and the bill passes, then I'm going to benefit. And so this is what we call free riding. And so I don't have to necessarily contribute to. If you think, for example, of gun ownership in the US, and for example, the NRA membership, which I believe I heard was about 5 million, but 393 million guns privately held, you can sort of see clearly not everyone is in the NRA. And so, some people might also not contribute because they think their contribution is too small for whatever is going on, but also sometimes the money is used to things that are not supported by the group members or by individuals. And so, we think about the role of these groups, particularly through lobbying, which is, as we mentioned, the efforts to influence public policy through contact with public officials. And so this can be done inside and outside. So inside is where groups develop and maintain Rolodexes, which you probably have not heard of, but so they maintain these contacts with our policymakers. They interface with them a lot, and they try to influence them. And so when we think about especially gaining access to officials, there are attempts at overwhelming officials with information or just supplying them with the right information, data they do not have, so that they can support the position or see the reasons for certain positions that are taken by individuals or groups. Now, so this requires an understanding of the issue, not just passion, but also an understanding, but also, you know, the access, and this can be challenging. So sometimes you hear about peddling influence. Now, a lot of times you'll find people who work in government go into politics, or people who work in politics then go into government or into lobbying. And so this revolving door can be troublesome if you see things like peddling influence or lobbying foreign agents, those kinds of things. And so the different groups and individuals who are targeted are in all the three branches of government. And so it's not necessarily one thing, but you have to think about, for example, the lawmakers who actually make the laws, including budgets and spending money, who have to make the laws. And so these are some of the highest targets. Now, this is a glance into the top lobbying groups and their spending levels. And so you can sort of see, for example, realtors. There's a whole case in the media right now about inflated commissions and whether that will be undone. U.S. Chamber of Commerce, of course, is one of the biggest spender on lawmakers and others. Business Roundtable, and you can see also, you know, the medical area is very well represented. American Medical Association, American Hospital Association, Blue Cross and Blue Shield, Pharma Research and Manufacturers. So, you know, this is quite a bit of lucrative work there. Now, there are times when you see bureaucrats, legislators, and lobbyists come together, where they seek policies that benefit a certain interest. And so these are common interest groups. There are also issue networks which are sometimes ad hoc. In other words, they comport at certain times. Officials, lobbyists, and policy specialists who will come together temporarily to solve a problem or to address a problem, or to get an outcome. For example, you might find that business leaders might come together with lobbyists and officials to craft ideas around something like tax cuts and so on. Now, sometimes the worst case scenario is that you see the networks, like the lobbyists and the industry, actually writing legislation and giving it to legislators to pass, which is probably not how government should work. Now, when we think about how these things are related, you begin with, for example, constituents, interest groups, defense contractors, and so they support, they lobby the government, whichever area of government it is, and so then the government is going to, for example, pass legislation to create something new, for example, new aircraft carriers or new ships. Now, in turn, the interest groups will give support to Congress once favorable legislation is passed. So, you know, donors and those kinds of things. But so you also see government and interest groups having this nexus of program administration, and so sometimes you'll find that people in government will become program administrators. One of the maybe examples of this that we can identify with is the administrator for NASA. NASA, the National Aeronautical and Space Administration. His name is Bill Nelson. He was a senator from Florida, and so he was in the Congress for quite a while, and then became the NASA administrator. So you can sort of see government going to interest groups. But also, government does also have constituent services that are funded through these networks. Now, we did talk about inside and outside lobbying. So outside lobbying is where you bring public pressure to bear on policymakers. One really good example right now, however we feel about that, is the marches against the government support for Israel, for what's going on in Palestine. And so sometimes you can have this outside pressure. Another example would probably be the Montgomery bus boycott and the civil rights movement and March on Washington and those kinds of things. And so, but also electoral action can be brought to bear. And so this is outside pressure being forced onto the government or administrations. The other thing that you see, another maybe good example of this is, for example, when police jurisdictions or police agencies enter into consent decrees with the Department of Justice. So this is often, public or pressuring the government to do things like police reforms and so on. And so you can sort of see the differences. So inside lobbying, contacts with legislators and executive, information to key officials, coalitions with other groups, or outside lobbying is group members to contact their representatives or to take part in marches or do other things that help in supporting the cause for which they are marching. And so these efforts, the outside efforts, might include things like public demonstrations, letter writing, and so on. And so the NRA is especially very good at. In fact, the NRA gives scores on sort of fidelity to the Second Amendment. And so you'll hear legislators touting this. I have a 100% score on the National Rifle Association. But of course, if you're a Democrat, you probably have a terrible score with the NRA. Now, in terms of how grassroots or other lobbying or interest groups turn their interests and passions into money, we have to think about, or into legislation, we have to think about votes and monies. Now, political action committees or PACs, and sometimes you also hear super PACs, these are organizations that are formed in order to pool resources and contribute to campaigns. Now, in theory, the amount, just like with individuals, the amount that a PAC can contribute to the candidate is limited, but particularly super PACs are not limited, particularly if they do not coordinate their campaigns with the candidate. So there are these loopholes, but also the question of whether super PACs are corporations, and whether corporations are people and they have a voice. And this is a continuing debate, particularly after the 2010 Citizens United versus the FEC. So again, who gets the money? Incumbents get about 7 times the money, but also they get re-elected about 95% of the time. Now, this is actually very interesting to examine because, for example, currently there are quite a number of congressional officials who are jumping ship and not running again, and so there's going to be openings for new people. There are primaries and there's all kinds of competition, but incumbents kind of tend to get, they tend to get re-elected. So super PACs are what I mentioned as independent expenditure only committees. So they collect money and then they distribute this money. They are not allowed to contribute to the candidate or rather to coordinate with the party or the candidate. So you might see For example, I think one of the most interesting advertisements is one of Jesus, and I'm sure you probably have seen it if you're watching sports. So there is no direct attribution to any particular political party or candidate's position, but you will hear of, for example, evangelical Protestant voters and how they vote and so. But there's also other super PACs. For example, the Koch brothers will run advertisements talking about free trade and maybe different things, and so these are super PACs. They are unrestricted in their fundraising and spending, and the disclosure of donors is not required. So there's questions about whether elections are being bought, but and their whole existence and whether they should disclose the donors and so on. But if I was a candidate and my cause is being supported, I don't know if I care who is supporting it. Maybe. Yeah. So these are now when we sort of think about the interest group system, we clearly see that they are biased in favor of economic groups. They hold the most clout, they have the most money. But there's also those who think that organized groups can be a source of good governance, as a good source of public pressure, but also even unorganized groups. So you may not have been paying attention 7 years ago, 2017, 6 years ago, when a travel ban was imposed on the US, and people just flocked to the airports to want to protest this ban and to see what they could do to help. And so these are examples of citizens who are expressing their opinion, their position, their dislike of current government expenditure or rather policy, and so they can shape governance. So was, for example, the idea of kids being held in cages, and you can sort of see how groups can even shame the government to take a different perspective and approach. Now, they do get government to pay attention to people's needs. So BLM is one good example of this, and the Department of Justice will usually then be moved into doing some things, but there's a question of who is represented, whose interests they represent, and whether they are just bought and paid for, as a certain candidate says. Now, when we think about the role of interest groups, we have to think of them as pursuing specific interests, but at the same time, the government's role is to serve the public interest. And so, what is this incompatible, or is this maybe not entirely compatible? So we have to sort of think about what a country, a democracy, a society is, and there's no homogeneous society. In fact, a lot of these societies are collections of separate interests put together in the umbrella that is the state. And so while most political parties will generally stay away from controversies unless it's part of their DNA. So for example, if you watch the ongoing debates about reproductive rights or abortion rights, you can distinctly see which political party is on which side of what issue. If you think about gun ownership and those kinds of things, you will see what kind of which party is on that issue. Same thing with, for example, welfare and so on. And so even though they do focus on broad issues, they also sometimes have to take a position on some of these more specific issues. And so sometimes they are the target of interest groups which would like to see action or inaction on one or many of the interests of the issues before them. And so when we think about the public interest, the functioning for democracy requires public interest in publicly interested peoples, because when you think about special interests, they do tend to influence policy. And so if you have an idea about, say, an issue and you want to get your senator's perspective on it, you're probably going to have less success than, say, a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. And so there's the question of how much public interest sways legislation and legislators more than private interest, their special interests, as they're called. Now, sometimes they want very specific accomplishments or exemptions. Here's an example. The airline industry, after the crash of Continental flight from New York to Buffalo in 2009, called Ghana, there was imposed a rule that any person flying passenger aircraft in the US had to have 1,500 hours of experience. It's generally called the 1,500 hour rule. And so airline lobby groups have been trying to get this, thrown out, maybe reduced. And, this, as a passenger, if you're going to be flying soon and you might experience these delays and shortage of pilots and so on. And so on the one hand, you might ask, well, what if someone had 1,400 hours or 1,300 hours? Should they probably be allowed to fly? Because if then it alleviates the traffic jams, plane jams called traffic jams. Anyway, if it alleviates a congestion in airports, and so, there are, you can almost see those positive arguments, but then you revisit the accident and you're thinking, oh, maybe they need 1,500 hours of experience so that 49 people don't lose their lives. And so we do see that the lobbying group, for example, they can get the rule relaxed, but is that good for the public? And so you will actually see the lobbying that goes to political parties actually help government accomplish certain things. And so for example, the Tax Cuts in Jobs Act of 2017 is an example of, is that what the majority wanted? And so there's no equal representation in the interest group system. I don't think any of us as a lobbyist, but the wealthy do. And so the well-funded interests and groups have more clout, even though sometimes they also embellish their abilities, but also maybe misuse money. For example, the NRA, they had a whole controversy. But again, these are things to keep in mind. Now, the question of interest groups and lobbyists goes back a long way. So as you can see, to Federalist number 10, where the idea is that a free society must allow the pursuit of self-interests, but are we allowing the pursuit of self-interest at the expense of public interest? So the balancing of that must be, I think, something that the country and political parties work towards. Checks and balances are important. They protect rights, but also sometimes they help exaggerate the special interest groups. So for example, few legislators will touch Social Security because, it's a third rail, and, if you touch Social Security, that's political malaise. Actually, I wanted to use a different word. But so there are interest groups that will not let any legislation change, improve. And so the question is, are they necessarily helping the country or not? And so sometimes they can wield too much influence over individuals or agencies. Now, sometimes it might not look like it's important. For example, the recent discovery that the New Jersey Senator Menendez, I think, was accused of taking money from Egyptian interests. So you might think, well, why do we care about Egypt again? But again, what else is happening and what do people not know? And so, in reflection, it's useful to think about these ideas, how iron triangles and network issues differ, how lobbying inside and outside differs, and why they are more organized interest groups in the US than other Western democracies, and so on. And so we shall conclude this discussion here. Hopefully you will have time to review these questions and develop some answers. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.